We are rolling on 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to We Up Talk. Dave and Steve here, and we've got on the phone with us, Steve, a gentleman who has, I think, had a tremendous impact on the world of civil rights and human rights.
Yes, indeed.
Mr. Ben Jealous, president of the NAACP. I guess we should say now outgoing president of the NAACP.
Yes.
Ben, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm sort of, I think, it's a bit of a bittersweet moment. You know, I'm going to miss my staff and the volunteers and working with them in the role of president and CEO, but I am looking forward to having more time with my family and really looking forward to getting more involved in straight up politics like I was before I came here.
Sure. And let me say that this is the first time in my memory, and I don't know about you, Steve, but this is the first time in my memory when someone has actually said they're resigning or leaving a position to spend more time with their family, and it really seems to be just that, and not a cover. So good for you.
Thanks, man. Yeah, no, there were many wise folks in Washington who said, "Look, I understand that's the reason, Ben. Just don't say it because nobody will believe you." I was like, "Look, man, this is the 21st century. If a man who wants to spend more time with his 15-month-old son and his 7.5-year-old daughter can't just say it, like, when is that going to be possible?"
Right. That's right. Fantastic. And kudos to you on that, because we know that this is one of the tender areas in our community, what's happening with our young people and our families. Has that, have the, I guess I'll say, the civil rights or social implications of that also informed your decision in any way?
Well, sure. I mean, my children have, frankly, fueled my fight here at the NAACP. It's one of the reasons why I've stayed so focused on mass incarceration, and on racial profiling. I want my daughter. My daughter can marry whoever she wants. Right? If she decides she wants to marry a white person like my mom did, or a woman, that's fine with me. But if she wants to marry a black man, I want there to be black men for her to marry.
Right.
And when you look at the rate at which our young men are being shot dead in the street, and we want to believe that they're sort of all the ones who are being killed are somehow not well educated and would not be worthy of marrying our daughters, but it's simply not that true. When you kill that many young men, there's a lot of very promising young brothers who get shot down, and then you look at the extreme numbers in prison, and you consider the fact that this has been going on now for at least 20 years at the apex, and it's been growing over the last 40 years. And so look, that's it was a big part of why I came here. But now that I've been here, we've helped turn the organization around. We've got a much stronger footing. I look at my son Jack, and I think of all of the young boys who I used to work with every weekend in the boys program I ran at St. Mary's Church in Harlem throughout the early 90s, and how much they miss their fathers. And the reality is that your kids miss you whether you're doing good work or whether you're in prison. You know what I'm saying? Like at the end of the day, it's nice to have a good reason why dad isn't home. But in the first year of my son's life, I traveled 145 days, and I was probably wiped out from that travel another 70 days. And that's 210 out of 350 days that I just won't get back with my son. And so it's I think it's important for us as men, as fathers, to be very intentional about spending as much time with our children as possible. And I'll tell you what, there was a moment that really kind of drove it home for me. I was at a prison. I was visiting one of our prison branches, and we were actually at a low security facility. And there was a young white guy who was incarcerated. We actually have lots of white members of many of our prison branches. And he had this photo of his daughter around his neck. So he had like his ID card. This low security prison gets you in and out of different doors. And then he had this photo of his daughter in this kind of nylon clear envelope around his neck, and hanging on a lanyard. And And I said, wow. I said, your daughter's beautiful. I said, how old is she? 2? He said, actually, she's 7 now. But her mom's so angry at me for being here that she won't let me talk to her.
Oh.
And it was just one of many moments where I was just looking at this man who was missing his kids and realizing, I'm much more blessed. I got to see my kids roughly half of last year, but again, you just don't get that time back, and and I think it's important for us as men to really know what all of our limits are, including how much time we just have to find a way to spend with our children, no matter what, even if we have to make tough professional decisions.
Well said. You brought up mass incarceration. I'd like to stay there for just another few moments. Sure. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, does an excellent job of diagnosing systemically what the problems are, as it relates to mass incarceration. But what I'd like to do is to move beyond the system, meaning the political system, the governmental system, and look sort of at the black community's side of this. I mean, do you when you look at the fact that we are overrepresented in the prison population, do you think as a community, our community institutions, do we own any part of this problem, or is it just historic racism and governmental systems and the privatizations of prisons and all these other things? From the first day of the first black newspaper through the sermons at most black churches last Sunday, I think our community has always been very clear that personal responsibility is always part of the equation for any individual's suffering. If you go back to Freedom's Journal, the first black newspaper, I think published in 1827, the first issue was just 2 pages. The first page was the voice of abolition. Today, that would be the voice of the civil and human rights movement. But that was our origin, right? This is the voice of abolition, for the first time printed in black voices. And on the back page was basically how to survive. It was what you have to do to get a job. It even included how to use a toothbrush. As a newly free black person in New York City, where the paper was published. And so we've always had those twin communities, those twin conversations in our community, and even within the NAACP, internally we talk about personal responsibility. Externally, we talk about public policy. Right, that's what the public conversation should be about. And the reality is that when you look at how drug policies in this country, when you look at who uses pot and who gets busted for using pot, it is hugely racially skewed. When you look at who uses crack and who gets busted for using crack, the largest cohort of crack users is middle-aged, middle-class white men. But you wouldn't know that if you looked at who actually got busted for it. And so we in this country just have to recognize that we have an addiction to incarceration that is as shameless as it is shameful. A black man in our country today is more than 3 times as likely to be incarcerated as a black man in South Africa at the height of apartheid, when that country was the world's leading incarcerator. A white man in our country today is almost 3/4 as likely to be incarcerated as that black man was in South Africa at the height of apartheid, when South Africa was the world's leading incarcerator. In other words, we haven't just taken over the pole position, the leading spot as the world's leading incarcerator. We've taken it to an entirely new, insane level. And it is expensive, and it largely fails for the new things we are using it for. It is not an effective cure for homelessness. It's not an effective cure for mental illness. And it certainly is not an effective cure for drug addiction. We're 7 times more likely, dollar for dollar, to succeed by sending a poor drug addict to, because rich people get Betty Ford, poor people get prison. Sending a poor drug addict to rehab than we are to prison. 7 times more effective, rehab versus prison, for a
for low-level crimes that are the product of drug addiction. And that's why people like Governor Deal in Georgia, who are fiscal conservatives and Tea Party governors and generally not thought of as civil rights proponents, have found common cause with us in shrinking the size of Georgia's penal system. Newt Gingrich calls it right on crime. Kamala Harris, the black Democrat Attorney General of California, in her book calls it smart on crime. 90% of each one of them, what each one of them say is the same. It's just that Newt believes in privatizing prisons and Kamala and I don't. And so I think that's the good news, David, Steve, in all of this, is that at this moment we have, if you will, a big silent majority of people in this country, on the far right, on the far left, and across the who have figured out that we can do better. We can be right on crime. We can be smart on crime. It's the same thing at the end of the day. We have better options than incarceration, and at the top of the list is making sure that poor drug addicts get what rich drug addicts get, which is Betty Ford, not prison.
This is We Up Talk, Dave and Steve. We're very happy to have on the phone with us Ben Jealous. He's the president of the NAACP. He's outgoing president, actually, and he'll be transitioning into some new areas of interest, and we'll talk about this before we wrap this up today. But I want to ask you now about some research that Dr. David Williams at Harvard University has been publishing and is beginning to, from what I've noticed at least, it's beginning to get some traction in the black community among academics and intelligentsia, and that is the idea or the concept of racism being a public health issue. Mm-hmm. Have you given any thought to this? And if so, what conclusions have you reached about this?
Sure. Well, we work on health disparities here at the NAACP very aggressively. As one of our big foci, frankly, has been getting the black church to get more involved in fighting the spread of AIDS in our community and HIV, and more comfortable, talking the brass tacks of how we stop the flow of stop the spread of HIV from the pulpit. Talking about safe sex, talking about clean needles, talking about the things that you got to talk about if you're going to have a real conversation with your congregants about stopping the spread of HIV. When you look at the disparities, part of what's real is that there are many places where people of color are treated differently in the hospital than white people. Classic studies done, for instance, about doctors' perception of pain. And simply believing that black people can deal with more pain than white people. So literally same exact issues in the medical chart, but very different dosages of painkillers being given. And that sort of as a bellwether, if you will, for the fact that doctors look at a brunette and a blonde and will treat them the same, but look at a black person and a white person and may know intellectually that the difference in skin color is no more significant than the difference in hair color between that brunette and that blonde, but yet allow themselves, even unconsciously, to come to conclusions that are not based on the medical facts, but based on the color of the person in front of them. You also have a sort of the systemic equivalent, which is that our country tolerates underinvestment, whether it's education or health, in communities of color in a way that we just wouldn't if we thought of those communities as white. And there's been a lot of important work done by a guy named John Powell, who used to be at the University of Ohio. Actually, Michelle Alexander used to work for him there at the Kirwan Center, and now is at UC Berkeley, about implicit bias. And one of the kind of systemic impacts of implicit bias that he's found is that as the images of poor people in the media shift over time in countries from the U.S. and then England, even France, from white people to people of color, the public's willingness to invest in the commons, right, in public education, public health care, decreases substantially. So if you think about the Great Depression, the images of poor people during the Great Depression were largely of white people. If you think about the war on poverty, they were largely of black people. And if you look at public polls from those times and other reflections of public will, what you see is that the country was more willing during the Great Depression, when they thought of poor people as white, to do more and go further than they were in the 60s, let alone by the 80s, when, if you said food stamps, for instance, we started to think, oh, well, that's almost all black people. No, actually, it's still, to this day, the biggest cohort of people on food stamps are white. Mm-hmm. But so you can see it play out, if you will, everywhere, from individual doctors to decisions to disparities in the healthcare system to even the will to marshal the resources to fight a disease, which is why, for instance, institutions in the black community more focus on HIV is so important, because, again, the image of somebody suffering from HIV has shifted over time from being a white male to being a black woman, and the fear, and it's playing out in some extent, to some extent in the allocations, is that the country simply will invest less in fighting it because they see it as a black problem.
Mm-hmm. So what do we do if we've got people like Dr. Williams and Dr. Powell or Mr. Powell saying that racism is in fact a public health issue, and you obviously subscribe to that point of view, as do I and Steve. What do we do to get this to translate into being more than just a concept that we embrace, but something that we can actually attack via public policy, legislation, social movements, and so forth? What has to happen next?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that we have to really keep on putting the issue out there, putting forward various proposals, and organizing to get them passed. We at the NAACP, over the past 5 years, have gone from being simply what we had been for almost 100 years, the largest civil rights organization in the streets, to what we are today, which is the largest in the streets, the largest online with 1.3 million activists organized online, the largest on mobile with 423,000 on mobile, second only to the Obama campaign itself, and the largest at the ballot box, the number one nonprofit, nonpartisan group in the country in both signing people up to vote door to door and in pushing new and unlikely voters out to the polls. And we can win tough battles if we're organized. In this country, there's two types of power: organized people, organized money. The trump card is always with organized people, but they have to be organized. The other part of it, and this is probably the piece that is being done the least now, where the most is needed, and it's a place where both the media and civil rights organizations can play a role and have played a role in the past, is match pair testing. It's an old school concept. You take a white person and a black person. Oftentimes, literally, professors would use two members of the campus glee club. So they would take, a young black guy in a blue blazer with pressed chinos and a crisp white Oxford and a big smile, and they'd find that white guy who was approximately the same height and trained to perform in the same way, both part of the glee club or some sort of singing quartet, wearing the same blazer and the same shirt and the same khakis and the same shoes, the same type of smile, and they would send them out with identical resumes to apply for the same job, and they would see what would happen. And they'd send them out to apply with the same credentials for the same loan, and they would see what would happen. And over time, we developed sort of knowledge. Like, for instance, it's easier for a white construction worker to get a home loan than a black professional who has the same credit but higher income because they're a professional. Mm-hmm. But that study was done like 25 years ago, and it turns out that the last big national match pair studies were done 25 years ago. Why is that important? Well, it's important for two reasons. One, people believe stories. They remember stories. They remember that newspaper article about the two Harvard students, one black, one white, who both went down to Fleet Street to apply for investment jobs. This case happened in the late '80s, and they happened to have they were wired, and they had a recording device that captured the conversations. And the black one was told, "No, we don't have any jobs. Try back next month." And the white one was told, "Yeah, we have jobs. And do you have any friends?" Right? Because we don't want to hire you. We want to hire everybody like you. And so we have to go out there and do it. The other thing is that where this is still being done on a small scales, it's still yielding very disturbing results. There's a professor at Princeton you might want to have on the show sometime named Deva Pager.
Okay.
And I'm a big fan of her work. I think I've only talked to her briefly once on the phone, but big fan of her work. She has a book called Marked. It came out in the mid-2000s. It's based on research out in the early 2000s when she was at the University of Chicago as a graduate student. And she looked at a few different populations of people, and among them were formerly incarcerated people, ex-felons, we commonly refer to them, and young people who weren't ex-felons, both trying to get into the job market. She looked at them, white ex-felons, black ex-felons, white young people who had never been convicted, black young people who had never been convicted. What she found was that it was very hard for a white ex-felon to find a job. There's a lot of unnecessary discrimination against formerly incarcerated people. Sometimes it makes sense. You don't want a convicted rapist installing, heating in somebody's house. But a lot of times it didn't, make sense. Like keeping somebody who had been busted for pot possession from folding T-shirts in the storeroom of your major department store.
Right.
It was very hard for a white ex-felon to find a job, but it was even harder for the young black man who had never been convicted to find a job than the white ex-felon. Well, it turns out at the same time there's a study that came out from UCLA that said that it was in the best interest of most black men numerically, and I don't recommend this, but they were just saying statistically it was in the best interest of most young black men for every employer to do a criminal background check, because most employers thought that every young black man was a criminal, and of course most aren't, and so having it confirmed made it more likely that any other young black man would get hired by that employer.
Okay.
Now, if you put the two studies together, what it suggests is that of course, it's incrementally slightly easier for the white guy who's a felon to get hired than the black guy, when most employers think every black guy is a felon. Because the white guy who tells you, who discloses and says, look, I did this, I paid a price for it, is seen as the honest crook. And the black guy who doesn't disclose, because he's not a felon, if you're the employer who assumes every black man is a felon, is seen as the lying crook.
Wow, that's crazy.
So we've got to start getting those stories out there, and the only way to do it is to really go back to the old school, send out the match pairs, record what happens, and then talk about it. Because you can talk about statistics all day. If the statistics don't fit people's preconceived notions, they're unlikely to be accepted by them.
Yeah.
But if you confront people with those two young college students who've been treated very differently, if you have the conversations on tape, or you just, have them talking about their experiences, it can actually change people's minds. And we've got to get back in the business of changing people's minds.
This is We Up Talk, Dave and Steve. We've got just a few more minutes left with Ben Jealous, outgoing president of the NAACP. I've just got a couple of other questions for you, Ben. One is about your plans beyond the NAACP. You told my colleague at USA Today, Dwayne Wickham, that you're going to be creating a PAC to cultivate candidates of color. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, and what I told Dwayne is that I was thinking about it and exploring. It was the big question I was leaving with, and that's where I am right now. I've had a number of fairly serious conversations, and am beginning to move forward with a feasibility study on whether or not we can put together a large, self-sustaining PAC to really accelerate the transformation of the Southeast and ultimately the country as a whole. When I look at the demographic trends and rely on my years of organizing throughout the Southeast, from my days as a young organizer in Mississippi through my days, now at the NAACP, what's clear to me is that black voters are growing at a substantial pace in the Southeast. People are moving back, and we continue to have a relatively high birth rate. Latino voters are moving into the South in ways people 20 years ago just didn't anticipate. And white people are becoming less concerned about the race of who they vote for faster than we anticipated. This is happening for two reasons. One, this rising group of young voters just simply is sticking with the trend that has occurred the last few generations, of each generation being less racially hung up than the last. But also, these fundamentalist attacks on women's rights, pushing a lot more of the established, older white female swing voters to vote for progressive candidates, and so that's making the trend happen even faster. And so, what that means is that changes that we thought would happen as far as blacks being able to win at the statewide level, for instance, in Mississippi 30 years from now, might be possible 10 years from now, might be possible 5 years from now. Things that we thought wouldn't be happening in Georgia for another 10 years could happen in 2 or 3 years. And so, I'm very interested in the possibility of us creating a new South, if you will, a South that really for the first time represents the interests of the majority of the people, black and white, in the region, who, quite frankly, are struggling more than they should be, and who need to be working together for the sake of the future of all of the region's children. You know, David, there's one thing that really kind of gives me hope, and it's I think that perhaps our country has gotten it wrong about the origin of race relations in this country. You know, for a lot of us, we can't remember racial history beyond roots. And so we assume that the original state of race relations in this country is one of bitter division. Well, it turns out, when you actually dig deep into the history, like, for instance, if you look at Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, and you read about 1663, 350 years ago this year, in Gloucester, Virginia, what you see is that white indentured servants and black slaves rebelled together. And they did it again in 1675, 1676, in Bacon's Rebellion. And what happened after those was very intentional legislation passed to divide the two groups and to pit them against each other. And we've dealt with the fallout ever since. And why is that important? Well, it's important because one of the reasons that they call it political science when you go to a university is we believe that there are laws in politics, at least things that are almost as true as laws in physics. In fact, we believe politics and physics share a couple of them. One is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So, for instance, Obama wins one cycle and the Tea Party pops up at the next cycle. The other is that something in motion tends to return to its original state. And I guess my theory is that for too long, we have fooled ourselves into believing that the original state of race relations is one of bitter division between blacks and whites, especially in the South. And actually, when you look at the deep history of this country, it may just be the opposite. And so we may be on the verge of actually returning to a place we were 350 years ago, where black and white working people in the Southeast can set race aside and focus on our common interests and transform the country into a place that is not defined by the oppression of both groups, but by the liberation of both groups from the bondages of what all of those decades and centuries of division has wrought for each of us.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, it'd be great.
Start in Alabama.
Yeah.
Tough state. You know, really. This is one instance where Mississippi might be a little easier just because of the numbers. But
wow.
Yes, we've you know, the beautiful thing, Steve, is that the Deep South, as I tell people, it's old school. You know, like in a new house, you have a dimmer switch. You can make the light go up a little bit or come down a little bit. The Deep South, it's still just a straight-up switch. It's on or it's off. Yeah. You know, and so the beautiful thing is that you can be in total darkness one moment, and then, bam, things just flip. You know, we saw that happen in North Carolina twice. We saw it almost 10 years ago when things, flipped on around 2006, and they were passing racial justice acts and expanding voting rights protections, and we saw it flip off in 2010 and 2012. And now they're, really in the bitter throes of it. But what keeps our folks down there fighting so hard is they know that they can flip that switch the other way.
Mm-hmm. My final question is real easy. You mentioned your daughter earlier, and you said that you hope that or you expect that she will be able to marry whomever she wants, and you specifically mentioned a woman. Do you feel that in the black community, we truly are beginning to turn the corner on how we're reacting to and evaluating same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage?
No, look, certainly, and to be clear, I mentioned three possibilities: a white man, a black man, or a woman of any color.
Sure.
And the bottom line is that I want, at the end of the day, whoever my daughter loves, I want her to be able to marry them. I saw the damage that it did to my own family for my parents to live in a world where it took the Supreme Court to legalize my parents' marriage in my mom's home state. Mm-hmm. And I know how we were treated as children by people who resented that decision and wanted to believe, that I was a bastard, basically because my parents were of different races and therefore their marriage was not valid in the eyes of God. Mm. What we're seeing in the last couple of years, and it's been one of the real major developments of the last couple of years, is that after Obama came out, after the NAACP came out, a lot of other black folks have stepped up and said, they're right. This is a civil right. At the end of the day, no matter what my church may choose to do, my state should not play matchmaker and tell these people that they can't love each other, or that love cannot be recognized in the eyes of the state. And we've done polling in battleground and future battleground states, Virginia, Ohio, Georgia, Florida, that shows that more than 50% of the black community supports marriage equality. But that when you change the question to reflect the law that we just passed here in the state of Maryland, which became the first below the Mason-Dixon to embrace marriage equality on the ballot, it actually jumps to around 60%. And that's simply if you say, basically give the right for people of, for same-sex couples to get married in your state, but also at the same time, in the same breath, make clear that this doesn't impact what any church does, that any church, any temple, any synagogue can continue to marry or not marry whoever they want, which is their constitutionally protected right in the First Amendment to their Constitution. And so,
exactly.
It appears that even in the Deep South, the majority of black people at the end of the day would rather not have their state play matchmaker.
Mm-hmm. Ben Jealous, outgoing president of the NAACP, thank you for giving us some time today, and we wish you well as you and your staff make this transition. And we know the NAACP, as you've already indicated, and as we've seen, has really turned the corner financially in some other ways, and we know that it will continue to be in good hands because of what you've done.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. You all do great work on radio. You do great work in print, and I look forward to having the honor to be back on your show.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. We'll definitely make that happen. Take care.
Guys.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, Steve. Ben Jealous. Wasn't it something?
Yeah, I'm glad that he's not just going to call it quits totally.
Yeah. He obviously has a lot to contribute. I've admired him for since he began his tenure, because you could see that he was bringing some vitality and sort of a freshness of vision, and he also is clearly very well versed on history.
Oh yeah,
which
absolutely.
I think is
very important.
Key if you're going to be leading the nation's premier civil rights organization.
Right.
All right. Well, I guess we should go ahead and wrap it up for today. For Steve Murray, I'm David Person. God bless you, Yeah, I mean, there's really nothing else to say or do after that. You know, that's just one of those interviews that, you know, leaves you with a whole lot. There's a lot of stuff he said I want to just think about. So we'll just wrap it up here.
All right.
God bless you. More great gospel music is on the way. This is Talking Gospel, 94.5 FM, AM 1700, streaming on WEUPAM.com.